I'm so happy to have you here. I'm Joan Brzezinski, the director of the University of Minnesota China Center. I thank you for joining us today for our China Center's Considering China webinar, 5 Things to Know About China in the Era of Xi Jinping, with Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom. There will be a Q&A directly following the presentation, so please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many questions as we can before we have to conclude. Professor Wasserstrom is a distinguished professor of history at UC Irving, and he also serves as the director of Humanities Honors Program and holds courtesy appointments with law and in the literary journalism area. He often writes for both academic and general interest periodicals, and his work has appeared in publications such as the New York Times, The Guardian, Time Magazine, The Atlantic, Times Literary Supplement. His most recent books as editor are The Oxford History of Modern China, which was published in 2022, and is author of The Milk Tea Alliance, Inside Asia's Struggle Against Autocracy and Beijing, a short book was published in 2025, first in the US in English, and then in Taiwan, translated into Chinese. And then also he's published Everything You Wanted to Know About China, But We're Afraid to Ask. It's a very short primer on the Xi era and comes out in European Asian markets and will be, I think, just out right now here in the US. So please welcome Professor Wasserstrom.
Thanks so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. That was a lovely introduction. This book, this latest one, very, very short one that I'll be drawing on here, it's out in Europe and Asia, but it's still waiting for a North American publisher. But with luck, it'll be out by the end of the year in some way in the US. So I wanted to talk about 5 things that I thought would be worth having in your mind about China in the era of Xi Jinping. And I think each of them is something that's both relevant, but also I think challenges some kinds of enduring assumptions or misconceptions about China that sometimes take hold because of misunderstandings from afar, and sometimes also take hold or are reinforced by the kinds of official positions put out by the Chinese Communist Party within China. And I think some of the ones that stick the most are ones that are simultaneously reinforced by what's coming out officially from China and also what comes through in foreign coverage of China, not by the excellent journalists who are trying to present things in a nuanced way, but in a kind of soundbite driven way of thinking about China. So the 5 things that I'll highlight are that connecting China's present to its past matters and is important, but it often needs to be done in ways that are different from the ways that are routinely done. And I'll explain that more. A second point that I'll emphasize is that protests matter. They matter even in times when there aren't a lot of protests going on in China, in part because when protests do take place in China, they remind us that any kind of notion of all the people in China being on the same page about anything are just wrong, that there always are things percolating under the surface. But I think protests also matter as something to keep talking about because the way in which the government talks about, spins the narrative of protests in the past, tells us a lot about politics in the present, even when there aren't protests going on. And I'll explain something about that as well. A third point I want to emphasize is that it's important to think about the US and China as similar places as well as different places. And that I think there's a tendency to overemphasize the contrast between the 2 places. And it's not that they're the same at any one point, but sometimes something that seems unusual or exotic about China in the present is similar to something that's been true of the United States in the past. And sometimes there are unexpected parallels between the 2 countries at the same moment in time that get overlooked when we emphasize. And this is, again, something that's sometimes done from outside of China, inside of China, a tendency to think of the US and China as contrasting cases rather than comparable cases. A fourth thing I want to emphasize is that predictions are always problematic about China and about US-China relations. And this is due partly to a lack of information we have about Chinese politics. We now are really in a black box phase, more so than ever, I think, with Xi Jinping. He's incredibly an influential figure within Chinese politics, and we really have very little direct access to who he's talking to, what he's thinking about. We know what he says, but what's going on inside the inner workings of Zhongnanhai, where decisions are made within China. It's still not a typical term to hear, Zhongnanhai, but it is interesting. As Katie Stallard, one of the best journalists I know covering China, mentioned to me in passing, was that people know what you mean when you say the Kremlin, but when you say Zhongnanhai, you still have to explain it. But there's a similar way in which it's a kind of shorthand for where the center of decision making is. But predictions are problematic due to that black box quality, but also to the fact that the unexpected happens, not just within China, but outside of China, and things that happen outside of China complicate predictions about things happening inside of China. And then the fifth thing I want to mention, or sort of hammer home, is that no China story is simple. And that whenever it seems that there's a single lens that can be used to make sense of something happening in the People's Republic of China, it's worth thinking about what other lenses there are that can also help us better appreciate what's going on there. And I'll use as examples for that the fact that the internet is not a simple story of things being blocked in China. The Great Firewall is important, but if we just think about what's being censored, we're missing something very important about the internet. And I'll also, just because I'm currently writing a book about George Orwell and Asia, I'll use as another example the idea, thinking of China as a big brother state, like the one that Orwell imagined in 1984, is too simplistic. And that in fact, to think about China, it's often useful to think about another dystopian novel left over from the 20th century that sometimes gets talked about, Brave New World, that is talking about an authoritarian regime that exists in part not because of striking fear into people, the way that 1984 imagines authoritarian control, but also keeping people distracted and satisfying their desires as opposed to playing on their fears. So those are 5 things that I'll try to talk through quite quickly and in a way that invites questions that then go further into it. But first, what I want to do is something that I've taken to trying to do whenever possible in the era when talks are recorded so that people can potentially watch something and not be sure necessarily where the talk was given and when it was given. And I like to do this in in-person events to bring home to an audience that what they are hearing is something that's happening right where it's taking place and right when it's taking place. With a Zoom event, the where is a little bit less obvious because I'm giving this talk from California, and you're watching it largely in Minnesota, but potentially anywhere. But I'm going to use the where to talk about what is specific to Minnesota about giving a talk like this about China, and what is specific about this moment in time, the middle of April in 2026. And I like to do this in part because it's something that reinforces the idea that while there are some things about China that one can write in a book that can still be relevant 5, 10, maybe 15, 20 years later, there's sometimes things that really need to be date stamped for a particular month or at least specific year. So this moment in time, I'm going to mention 2 things that are on my mind about this moment that relate to things that I'm talking about today. So one of the things I'm talking about, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about Xi Jinping and the need to come to terms with this distinctive stamp that he's been putting on the country while he's been in power. And it just struck me preparing for this talk that he rose to power in 2012. At the end of 2012, he became formally head of the Chinese Communist Party, which is the position he holds that is most powerful, even though sometimes he's referred to as a shorthand as President Xi Jinping. He became president of the state early in 2013. That was an added title after becoming head of the Communist Party. And the head of the Communist Party is really where his the most important position he's held is. So late 2012, when he became chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, general secretary, that is almost exactly 13 and a half years ago right now. And the reason why that number intrigues me is that we often think of the incredible stamp that Mao Zedong put on the People's Republic of China as its first leader. And the Mao era, at least when I went into studying China, which was soon after the Mao era, this was seen as this enormously important and just long period of time that Mao had been the most powerful person in what at that time was the most populous country on earth. Mao was in power from 1949 until his death in 1976. That was 27 years. Xi Jinping has now reached the point of having been in power as the most important person in China, no longer the most populous country on earth, but now the second largest economy, or by some metrics, even the largest. He's been the most powerful person in one of the most important countries in the world for half the amount of time that Mao was. And I think to reckon with that, it's a way of thinking about his significance that's worth keeping in mind. The other thing about this particular moment in time is that we've just marked, there have been some stories in the media about 25th anniversary. It's the 25th anniversary of what's referred to often as the spy plane crisis. This was in April of 2001 when an American surveillance plane was being buzzed by a Chinese plane when it was nearing the Chinese mainland. There was a crash that the Chinese pilot died. The American crew made an emergency landing on Hainan Island, part of the People's Republic of China, and it was unclear for a period of time what would happen to those figures. This was an event that was described radically differently by the Chinese press and by the Western press. All the sort of the heroes and villains in it were quite different, or the victims. The main focus in China, naturally, the victim was the pilot who died. In the Western press, it was seen as a crash where there was less of a clear victim there, and the fate of the crew were taken into account. But what interests me about that moment, there are all kinds of interesting human interest sides of it and a story, was that when that happened early in 2001, it was at a particularly tense period in U.S.-China relations. In 1999, 2 years before that, there had been another event that was handled very differently in different kind of coverage that put the United States and China at odds when NATO bombing raids on Serbia ended up missiles destroyed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and 3 citizens of the People's Republic of China died. And there were protests in China, which I happened to be in China when these took place. The one time that I was in China during a truly dramatic, tense moment, there were protests outside of the American embassy and outside of the British embassy, denouncing what was seen as American-led NATO hegemonism. Anyway, what's important to me for this talk about those 2 events taking place was that with these 2 moments of incredible tension in U.S.-China relations, there was a lot of discussion especially at the time of the spy plane crisis, that going forward, the major issue in the next decade in global affairs, many people thought, would have been tensions in US-China relations. And then a few months later, 9/11 happened and completely reset all sorts of geopolitical calculations and relationships. And suddenly, for a time, the tensions between the US and China stopped being something that people were focusing on as the big geopolitical issue of the moment. And something very different happened, which had implications clearly for the United States, but also for China. And the reason why I bring up this anniversary is a good reminder that just the unpredictability of world events can alter even the most kind of knowledgeable predictions. People who knew the most about the Chinese system and the US system were utterly confident that the time in the early 2000s, the defining issue was going to be US-China, how the US and China worked out its relationship. So this is, I think, an important, looking back to that 25-year perspective, and soon we'll have the 25-year perspective on 9/11, is a reminder that the difficulty of predicting where things are heading is both because of lack of knowledge about China or the United States and the people in power. And this is something that clearly is true as we think about a summit coming up between Trump and Xi Jinping, but that there also are things that don't have to do specifically with the US and China that alter radically the way the US-China relationship develops. And here we have the same moment before the summit, when people were thinking about Xi Jinping and Trump meeting in 2026, before the war in Iran, there were all sorts of predictions or expectations about what that meeting would be like. And these have been upended by what's happening in the world that's not about a conflict directly between China and the United States or relationship between the two. So I wanted to focus on those two moments to date stamp this and to place stamp it, in a sense, to talk about Minnesota. There's one kind of light way to think about how Minnesota is a particularly interesting place to talk about China. And the light way has to do with the kind of what I think of as the best journalism on China, which is often the journalism that reminds the reader continually of how diverse and varied the Chinese population is, and how the importance of not thinking about China in singular terms. And there was a time when much of the best writing about China in that mode, many decades ago, was by people who came from one state that begins with M in the United States, and that was Missouri. Some of the most important writers on China in the first half of the 20th century were people like Emily Hahn, Edgar Snow, Agnes Smedley, all of whom had ties to Missouri. And there were also many people who went to the Missouri School of Journalism who covered China as well. And Missouri still punches above its weight in writing on China. Peter Hessler, one of the most gifted writers on China now, is also from Missouri. But I started noticing early in the 21st century that even though there was a lot of talk about, there was even talk in the middle of the 20th century about the Missouri Mafia covering China, I was noticing that many of the people I was reading and learning the most from in popular accounts about China by journalists, including books as well as reporting, were people from Minnesota. So this is another M state that is now has been punching way above its weight. And I won't mention all of the gifted people from Minnesota, but if you heard Rob Schmitz on NPR reporting on China, he's from Minnesota. Mara Fistendahl, who wrote two of the best books on China that I like, is from Minnesota. Adam Minter, another gifted journalist, Mary Kay Magistad. There's just a whole set, and I'm leaving ones out. Michael Meyer, all of these people who wrote what I think of as importantly books that humanized the experience of Chinese people within China are from Minnesota. So I think that's a relevant thing to bring in, giving a talk hosted by by a Minnesota institution, the University of Minnesota. And thank you very much for hosting me here. The other thing that has Minnesota kind of a special relevance in the talk I'm giving in terms of more specifics is I mentioned that one of the things I'm going to talk about is how protests matter, both because of what people do on the streets and the way governments spin narratives about what people are doing on the streets. And I don't have to, I'm not going to be talking that much about the United States, but there's no question that when I'm talking about things related to China in that story, that there are clear Minneapolis kinds of parallels to think through. Okay, I want to talk about the 5 points and move through them quite briefly. And you'll get more on many of these things from this book, though it's very short, so you won't get that much longer a take on them. But I'm also going to update some of the things because the speed with which things change mean there are some things that have happened even since I finished working on that book late last year that now need to be updated. And I'll try to give shout outs at the end of that book. I give shout outs for a variety of other things for people to read. I think it's always important for authors to acknowledge the works they're drawing on and also point people to other things to read besides their own work. And I'll mention some things that have come out since that book was finished that if I'm updating it, I will add to the further readings. Okay, so connecting China's past to its present to its past, but not necessarily in expected ways. So there are kind of standard ways of connecting China's present to its past. And here I'll just focus on the idea of a Chinese leader. When you have a Chinese leader, there's one way of thinking of connecting him, and it's nearly always him, to China's distant past. And one of the ways, and Xi Jinping it plays to this, is to connect the Chinese Communist Party leader to previous Chinese Communist Party leaders, or to go way back in time and connect him to things in the Chinese distant past. So Xi Jinping would like you to think of him to some extent as carrying forward, though not in all ways, the legacy of Mao as a powerful leader of the People's Republic of China and somebody who was determined to assert China's place in the world. And then Xi Jinping also talks about connecting to a kind of Chinese distant past, talking about Confucian values and other things that go far back in time. Outside of China, there are some ways in which Chinese Communist Party leaders are compared to, in the same way, to previous Communist Party leaders. Xi Jinping is talked about as what he has in common with his immediate predecessors, the post-Mao leaders like Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, that talked about continuing the pattern of Communist Party rule that Mao began, but doing some things differently. That's one way of connecting Xi Jinping to China's past. Outside of China, sometimes there are also references to a play on a kind of unchanging, long-standing pattern of Chinese authoritarianism that sometimes talks about Xi Jinping as an emperor-like figure. So they jump back in time to the imperial period and talk about him as connected to that. What I want to suggest is that while you can get something from each of those kinds of comparisons back in time, there's a leader that Xi Jinping has a surprising amount in common with that it's not a perfect analogy. None of these analogies are perfect. I think historians should draw analogies, but always be aware that they're imperfect analogies. And this is summed up by the idea that history never really repeats itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. A notion, a lovely metaphor that's often attributed to Mark Twain, but it's one of the many things that Mark Twain probably never said. There's no suggestion, no evidence that he ever said that, but it's a wonderful concept. So who does Xi Jinping rhyme with that you might overlook if you jump just back to his immediate predecessors and Mao, or go back to the emperors of the past. The person who's missing from this, who I find very interesting to place beside Xi Jinping, is Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was Mao's arch enemy for much of both of their lives. He was the head of the Nationalist Party that was in control of the Chinese mainland, though from the late 1920s to the late 1940s, though for part of that time, a large part of that time, the Japanese invasion limited its ability to control the country. But the Nationalist Party had a period in power from late 20s to the late 1940s. And then Chiang Kai-shek his armies were defeated by Mao's armies, and Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan. Taiwan became the Republic of China, and he stayed in power there until he died in the mid-1970s, not that long before Mao died. So there are all kinds of reasons to present Mao and Chiang Kai-shek as contrasting figures, competing figures, and to think of them as kind of opposite figures. And then when you have Xi Jinping as leading the party and the country that Mao was in control of in his life, it may seem that connecting him to Chiang Kai-shek, that there's not much there to go on. But there is, if we look a little bit more closely at history. Chiang Kai-shek inherited control, became head of the Nationalist Party, was the most powerful head of the Nationalist Party after the founding leader of that, Sun Yat-sen. One can think of Xi Jinping as the most powerful leader of the Communist Party and of the People's Republic of China since the founding powerful figure in that with Mao. But there are other kinds of similarities as well. When Chiang Kai-shek was in control of the Nationalist Party, he presented himself as continuing Sun Yat-sen's legacy, but also broke with Sun Yat-sen's legacy in certain specific ways, including Sun Yat-sen had wanted the Nationalists to ally with the Communists. Chiang Kai-shek presented the Nationalist Party as anti-communist. There are other ways in which Xi Jinping talks about continuing things with Mao, but also breaking things with Mao. Like Mao, he believes in single party rule by the Communist Party, but unlike Mao, he has no patience for bottom-up mass movements. So there are ways in which they're both connecting themselves very much to the kind of aura of a founding leader, but also moving in a different direction. One of the ways also that Chiang Kai-shek one of the things that was important to think about Chiang Kai-shek that was carried on from Sun Yat-sen was Sun Yat-sen was fiercely anti-imperialist, thought that one of the problems with holding China back was mistreatment by foreign powers and bullying by foreign powers. That's something that Chiang Kai-shek continued to believe. That's something that Mao believed and that Xi Jinping has carried on from him. Sun Yat-sen and then Chiang Kai-shek were in some sense Leninist leaders without being Marxist leaders. They didn't believe in class struggle, that part of Marxism, but they believed in two parts of Leninism: single party rule, rule by a vanguard party that carried a country forward, and anti-imperialism. And Xi Jinping also is a Leninist leader in that sense. Xi Jinping also, though he insists he's a Marxist, spends a lot less time talking about class struggle than Mao did. Finally, when you thought about Chiang Kai-shek and Mao, if you thought about these parallels, that they were both Leninist leaders, they were both in charge of autocratically run one-party states, which is what Taiwan has not been for decades now. But in Chiang Kai-shek's lifetime, it was always a one-party authoritarian state. Chiang Kai-shek had very little tolerance for dissent and challenges to his rule, just as Mao did. There were parallels between those two places during their lifetimes. But if you wanted to point to something that you could know that a speech was by Chiang Kai-shek as opposed to by Mao, you could look at how they handled Confucianism and traditional Chinese values. Chiang Kai-shek would celebrate those, the kind of traits of harmony and the veneration of Confucius, whereas Mao was anti-Confucian and thought that a degree of chaos rather than harmony was what carried history forward. So the way you could differentiate these otherwise somewhat kind of parallel regimes was by zeroing in on that. When you look at Xi Jinping, when he talks about Confucianism, he sounds much more like Chiang Kai-shek than he sounds like Mao. There are other ways also, and related to this, Mao talked about there were limits to his promotion of gender equality, but he talked about women holding up half the sky. He talked about one problem with traditional Chinese society being traditional gender roles. Chiang Kai-shek, on the other hand, didn't talk about that kind of thing. You fast forward, and again, you have Xi Jinping more in step with Chiang Kai-shek than with Mao. There are other parallels as well. Some of this are kind of ways in which you can imagine Xi Jinping living out not just some of the dreams of Mao about a more powerful China in the world, but also the dreams of Chiang Kai-shek of a more powerful China in the world, and one that was somehow seen as both modern and in touch with ancient values. But there are also come sort of more maybe superficial, but also perhaps relevant ones. Chiang Kai-shek had a glamorous wife who played a role like first ladies in the American way of thinking of things. Other Communist Party leaders did not have wives that were seen that way. Xi Jinping does. So anyway, these are things that are just unexpected. It's an imperfect analogy, but it's one that I think bringing it into the mix maybe alerts you to the way in which there are various ways that if we want to go back into the Chinese past looking for things, we should be as eclectic and open to variation as possible. I mentioned protest mattering being something that that I wanted to emphasize. And here I've spent most of my career writing about protests, so I can go on at much too much length about that. So I'll just mention a couple of clear things. One is that we should never assume that that the possibilities for protest have disappeared, and that periodically we're reminded of this. There's a period. First of all, there are protests in China going on. There have been protests in China going on since Tiananmen of many kinds. Often they're local protests or protests involving a single issue, things like environmental protests. So there's never been a time when there's been a lack of protests within China. But periodically, there's been a time when it seems that the era of the People's Republic of China being rocked by large-scale protests or by protests in more than one place has disappeared, and then something reminds us of the potential for them. And Hong Kong in the 2010s was a reminder, was a part of the People's Republic of China that still was a place of protest. But then even more recently, near the end of the zero COVID policy, there were the white paper protests that broke out at multiple places within China at one time that surprised people, even people who study things like protest. It's another reminder of the ability to make room for the unexpected. But also before those white paper protests, there was a time when even when in Beijing, which is often seen as one of the most tightly surveyed places on Earth, and during the lead up to a Congress, to a gathering of the Chinese Communist Party, which is a time when surveillance is on extra high alert, there was a bold person who put up a banner denouncing Xi Jinping and his policies on a bridge in Beijing, and somehow managed to, though it got taken down and he disappeared very quickly. It managed to be something that was videotaped. He lit a fire that attracted videos to it, and that circulated around the world. Protest, I think another thing why protests matter is even at times when within the physical boundaries of the People's Republic of China, there have not been protests or not been many protests. There still are protests by groups outside of China concerned with what's going on inside of the People's Republic of China. Protests by exile from Han people who have left China, but also by Tibetans and Uyghurs in the diaspora, and more recently by Hong Kongers in the diaspora. There's a way in which a story of protest related to China can continue even in the moments when protests on the physical landmass of the People's Republic of China have become difficult or impossible, and that those kinds of protests outside of physical China also matter. And there are times in the past when they've mattered. There are times late in the Qing dynasty when revolutionaries had little space to operate within the physical Qing Empire, where important things were done in terms of protests, but also in terms of discussions of politics outside of China by exiles at that point and members of the diaspora, including people in like Liang Qichao and Sun Yat-sen in Japan. And there are also times in the past when it's not in a direct way, and this is not about predicting that something similar will happen again because history can rhyme without repeating itself. But there are ways in which, in periods in the past, the kinds of percolations of political ideas and activism outside of physical China percolated back in and had an effect within the physical China. So protests matter for that reason. Protests also matter because the way that people in power handle and try to stop protests, and also the way they tell stories about protests of the past, tells us a lot about them and also about the state of a country. And I won't go into, again, details about this, so I welcome questions about it. There are some ways in which what happened in Hong Kong in 2019, massive protests and then suppression, and something very much like martial law following, was seen as a series of protests that followed some of the same scripts as the Tiananmen protests of 1989, and that then were suppressed in ways that were much like the way the Tiananmen protests were suppressed, albeit without a massacre and with police rather than soldiers carrying out the suppression. There are ways in which 1989 and 2019, the Beijing and Hong Kong stories rhymed. But there are also things that are interesting that are different about the way things have unfolded since then. There are ways in which Hong Kong, which used to be unusually free as a place within the People's Republic of China, and still is in some ways freer than other parts in terms of having a freer internet. There are some ways in which it's actually become, there are elements of which, even without a massacre, there's been more intense repression rather than less intense repression of certain things after 2019 there than after 1989 on the mainland. When people who had been involved in the Tiananmen protests left China, there were never bounties put out on them to try to encourage them to be turned in and returned to China. There have been in the case of Hong Kong activists abroad. The sentencing of Jimmy Lai, the way in which other participants like Joshua Wong, Gwyneth Ho are being kept in prison for potentially expanding amounts of time is a different pattern than there are parallels to what happened to participants in the Tiananmen protests, but there are also differences. In the case of Joshua Wong, a new thing called charge stacking, which is new charges being brought against somebody while they're still in prison to try to extend their prison term. That was not something that was done with the students who were involved in Tiananmen and then arrested. There's also a way in which the story about what took place is handled very differently. And this is something that I did since I finished that book. I made a return trip to Hong Kong, and I went to a museum there of Hong Kong history where there's a whole exhibit devoted to the story of what happened in 2019 and the national security law imposed in 2020. And in that, there's a strong effort made to convince the people of Hong Kong, including school children who are taken there, to think a lot about what took place in 2019 and accept the government's story of it as a time of chaos when the place they love was almost destroyed, and it was saved by heroic action by defenders of order. On the mainland, there was an effort to promote that story briefly after the massacre of June 4th in 1989. But then the government gave up on that and shifted to a policy of trying to make people forget that anything had happened. And there's nothing like that kind of museum exhibit on the mainland, but there is in Hong Kong. So this is just something that there's much more to say about that. I co-wrote a piece about that with a very interesting woman named Victoria Jones, who had visited the same exhibit and is getting her PhD at LSE in Nikkei Asia. If you want to see that story, we co-wrote that. Moving quickly through the final things, US and China similarities are important as well as contrasts. There are all kinds of ways right now that the differences temperamentally and otherwise between Trump and Xi Jinping are emphasized. But there are also ways in which we can see them both as having some parallels and parallels with other contemporary leaders in being people who emphasize a pattern of strongman rule and talk about connecting with a particular set of what they view as traditional values. There are other ways in which China and the United States, at different periods in their recent past, have been seen as varied as the two places are. From an outsider's point of view, to think about China and the United States, and not just at this current moment, they can both be seen as places that have as our founding myths an idea of not being empires and actually is standing up to empires and rejecting a model of empire in the world, though this isn't being done right now by the United States, but for much of its history, an idea was that what the United States did wasn't empire building, and yet outside of the United States, what was seen was exerting control through formal annexation, but also through informal relations of dependency that was very much like an empire. And people have said that about the United States for a long time, and people have said that, I think, with justification about the People's Republic of China as well, despite its claims of being opposed to all things that are imperialist. There's an imperialist side to its actions in Xinjiang and Tibet, and there are ways into forming informal dependencies in nearby places are things that have been happening in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world. So it's worth thinking about ways that there are parallels as well as contrasts. And there are many more I could say. There are ways in which China now, things that are being said about China, both by people who admire it and people who are concerned about it, parallel things that were said about the United States in an earlier period in our past. For me, one of the things, just to give shout outs to other books, I'm struck sometimes by reading a book about the United States in the past that gives me a flash of insight about China in the present. And that happened most recently with Daniel Immerwahr's wonderful book, How to Hide an Empire, about the United States in the past, that I think is valuable to think about the People's Republic of China under Xi. And sometimes it happens in the reverse. There's something that I read about China that gives me a flash of insight about the United States. An example there is Emily Fang's very good book, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, which is about how under Xi, there's an effort to promote an idea from the top that there's only one kind of authentic way to be Chinese, or there's one set of Chinese values, whereas many people within China see themselves in very different ways. And there's been an element of that, clearly, in a way of imposing a view of unitary Americanness going on. Rushing forward, predictions are problematic due to lack of information, but also to the unexpected. I've already talked about that with an example at the beginning, so I'll skip over that now. And then finally, that no China story is simple. And I said I would use the internet and 1984, the idea of a big brother state, to illustrate that. And these two things go together. If we think about China as the kind of ultimate big brother state, it's often the Great Firewall and the kind of intensive surveillance made possible by new technologies of communication and surveillance is often emphasized. But there's a story about the internet that's more complicated than that. There's a way in which, for people living in China, they don't just continually think the internet is the worst possible version of the internet because it's so hard to access certain kinds of news stories or political debates. They also think, as Christina Larson said in an article quite some time ago, China can be seen as having the best and the worst internet in the world. That many people think that when it comes to to deciding what to do with your free time, to a restaurant to go to, movies to watch, China actually can be seen as having a more efficient, more user-friendly internet as opposed to a less one than others. And there's an excellent new book, one of the best books I've read on China since my own was finished, is this Yiling Liu book, The Wall Dancers, Searching for Freedom and Connection on the Chinese Internet, that talks about the creativity that people show on the internet and getting around blocks on the internet and finding incredibly creative ways through coded language, through creative activity, to circumvent the controls. And so the Chinese internet story is never just one about fear and blocking and banning. It's also about, as Margaret Roberts wrote in one of the books that I do talk about, I draw from in my book, a book Censored. She talks about when you think about the Chinese internet, don't just think about fear, which is what those stories and the Orwell vision thinks of it, but think also of friction, the way that the government just makes it harder for you to get access to stories that go against their even if they don't block them, even if they know people are going to get around the firewall's existence limits the speed with which people can get into things. But she also says, think about flooding. And here, if we think of the Chinese Communist Party's effort to control, like advertising, just fill people with more and more visions of what its version of the world is, and that it keeps people in some ways distracted or less able to think about alternatives. And there I'll end by just saying this is one way in which bringing these things together about the internet, even though it was often thought in the 20th century that Orwell's book explained Communist Party rule and Brave New World explained the problems with consumerism that would be kind of deaden the possibility for challenging authoritarian rule rather than fear, boot on the face modes of control. And there was a debate about this even in Orwell and Huxley's time, and there has been since then, that when we're thinking about China, it's worth thinking about the interplay between these two kinds of things, that some of what keeps the Chinese Communist Party in power is its ability not just to strike fear into people who might challenge it, but to keep people distracted and to satisfy their kind of desires for entertainment and things like that, that is more like what Aldous Huxley imagined in Brave New World. And it's also worth thinking about variation within the People's Republic of China, that some parts of it control is more like the 1984 Big Brother state, and here Xinjiang and Tibet would be classic examples of that. And some places it's much more the vision of Brave New World, where people are feeling that they're enjoying themselves a lot and have a lot of choices, and maybe not political choices, but have enough choices in other realms that it keeps them from focusing on the lack of choices in the political realm. And places like Shanghai would fit more into that. But these are never stable. I would have said until recently that Hong Kong was an example of much more the Brave New World mode than the 1984 mode. But now, as I suggested just a bit in talking about protests, there are ways in which Hong Kong is partly the Brave New World one and partly 1984. Now I look forward to questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Wasserstrom. We have a stack of questions here, so let's get to them. Our first commenter asks, she said, protest has dear consequences, prison and lifelong persecution for individuals due to the most extensive and most powerful state apparatus in China. How should it be administered, and what strategy might have a chance to prevail with a positive effect in the long run?
So, I mean, one of the things that clearly it's important to think about is that the Communist Party doesn't have one way of dealing with protests. Since Tiananmen, it's been obsessed with the idea of not having another thing like Tiananmen. And the important thing about Tiananmen, we remember it sometimes as a student-led, a student movement. It was students, but then it was members of other social classes that joined the students on the streets. We remember it as a Beijing event, but there were protests in 100 cities or so around China. So what the Chinese Communist Party has since then said is they do not want anything that has an organizational structure that connects people across social class lines and across geographical lines. And those things, anything that hints at that, is dealt with in a very intensive, repressive way. But other kinds of protests that are just about letting off steam about a local issue and perhaps just a specific group issue have tended to be tolerated more as a kind of safety valve. And then these don't remain stable. Hong Kong seemed like maybe a safety valve thing, but then its protests got bigger and spread across Hong Kong and then led to this other kind of crackdown. There's some things that were allowed as a kind of single group protest, like some feminist activism, but then that's under Xi Jinping been cracked down much harder. So it's not a stable thing, but I think it's important to think about the protests being put into different kinds of categories. Thanks.
And then also wonders what the Trump's government real attitude towards the Xi regime, and is there a different attitude representing the Trump government on the surface, or is there more deep inside thinking, do you think? And the consequence for this, the world being governed by three strong persons governing three superpowers and believing in the law of the jungle versus what our World War II allies had in previous years.
So this is the last part of that gives me an excuse to go back to Orwell again, who I'm just so obsessed with. I just recently co-wrote a piece for The Conversation, which is a great way to get academic ideas out into a broader. Of course, I co-wrote it with Emrah Atasoy, a Turkish scholar interested in dystopia. And we talked about the fact that Orwell's idea of three super states continually forging alliances and breaking with each other was something that seemed from 1984 like it was outdated, and yet suddenly it seems back in discussion. And I think it is really one thing it leaves out is the importance, which I think right now we're seeing and we should keep attention to, is that what's happening in places that are not in those three imagined super states in the moment, that are not allied with Moscow, Beijing, or DC, are going to be important going forward. There's a possibility of a more unified Europe that's emerging. There are middle states. There are places like India that are navigating between these. So it's wrong to think of it as this sort of three parts, but it is also, I think, a notable thing about the present that we have more people with more in common as the most powerful man in Washington, D.C., Beijing, and Moscow than has been true at any point since World War II. And that there are certain kinds of, a promotion of the idea of strength, an idea of connecting up to and sort of regaining things that were from an imagined past. These are things that are still there, and a distrust of certain parts of constraints from a global order, even if Xi Jinping right now is talking about protecting global institutions, and to some extent is desiring of that. I think with the Trump administration, we really just don't know. I mean, we're a parallel between the moment of Washington, D.C. and Beijing is we really have a very personalistic degree of decision making in both places, or if Xi Jinping is very likely getting much more advice and discussion, but we have very little access to those kinds of debates about those discussions of going on. So we're at some sense in a difficult remove there. We definitely know from Trump's own comments that he periodically has talked about his sympathy with protesters against Beijing, and expressed admiration for the strength of the Chinese Communist Party in dealing with things like Tiananmen or with other things. So there's a way in which the admiration for strength goes along with an acceptance of repression of protest.
Thank you. So one person asked, could you please remind us what the background of the white paper moniker was and how that nickname evolved for the post-COVID movement?
Thanks so much. Yeah, the white paper protests were that people held up blank sheets of paper because the idea was, and this has been done in satire in other places, including Russia and others during an earlier period, to say, we know that anything we put on a piece of paper is going to be deemed subversive by this government, which has um, no tolerance for protest. So it was a way of using satire and comedy, even though it was a very serious issue that was being raised. So it was a sign of creativity. Like, are you going to tell us that a blank piece of paper is banned? So I think it was a sign of that use of satire and humor to do that. And the protests themselves were against the zero COVID policy, and specifically triggered by some very tragic cases in which a intensely applied version of COVID controls had led to, rather than protecting lives, had led to deaths. And there was specifically a fire in Urumqi in Xinjiang that people had been unable to escape the fire because of blocks on their movement. And there had before that been somewhat related cases within factories. There was also a bus taking people to a quarantine zone outside of a city that crashed, and the people in it died. So it was a way of, but it was seen as a protest against a government that was no longer no longer thinking rationally about a policy, but had somehow become so invested in continuing the policy that it was going to continue it even with negative effects, rather than continually rethinking it. And some people later have talked about parallels between that kind of mindset and unwillingness to rethink and what happened with the one-child policy, when there was so much determination to not admit that this might have been wrong, that it was stuck to. And Dan Wong has a new book, Breakneck, that's been getting a lot of attention, that talks about the advantages of what he calls an engineering mindset, that it can get things done in a country. He says China has this, that it can get things done very quickly, like building up infrastructure, but it has this Achilles heel of becoming too attached to grand plans. And there are arguments I have with the book, but it's a very good read, and it's a very good book to think with. So I'd like to be able to give it a shout out as well as the others.
Thank you. So in March, the Chinese National People's Congress passed a resolution, a constitutional amendment, removing the two-term limit for the presidency, allowing Xi Jinping to remain in power indefinitely. What are the checks and balances on him and his government to prevent tyranny from happening?
There are very few checks and balances on him in many ways. And I think this was an example where one of the ways that when this happened was to think of it as it reinforced this idea of an imperial style of rule, and it reinforced the parallels to Mao, because Mao chose successors, but then the successors never were really allowed to be successors. So I think Xi Jinping's dilemma now is he can continue. As soon as he picks somebody as a successor, then there's another person with power to potential, and it opens up the possibility for factions. There's a great fear in the Chinese Communist Party of where things can lead when there are divisions within the Communist Party, which is carried over from being haunted by the specter of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the time of Gorbachev. And clearly, Xi Jinping doesn't want to be seen as a Gorbachev figure. He views Gorbachev as an example of how you don't rule, which is one thing he has in common with Putin, I think, which is an interesting thing to contemplate, given that one heads a communist party and the other doesn't. But at the moment, it's hard to see what the checks on Xi Jinping are. But I think it's important to remember the Chinese Communist Party is bigger than Xi Jinping, and we often find out after the fact about divisions within that. And there clearly are divisions within in views. There clearly are people who really dislike some things that Xi Jinping has been doing, not just ordinary people or people repressed by them, but people within leadership, but there's been a kind of mode of constant purges. So there's no basis for a clear set of emerged factions.
We have reached our time, so unfortunately, I don't think we can get to any more of these questions today. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again to Professor Wasserstrom for a very fascinating discussion. I also want to thank Kaime and Joseph Terry for their generous support of this program, and we invite you to help us provide engaging programming like this with a gift to the China Center. You can do so at a link on our website or on the webinar announcement. Please join us for the next webinar on May 19th with Professor Rongbin Han from the University of Georgia. Look for more information on that coming very soon. And thanks to all of you again for your support and interest in this series. It really helps us connect with a lot of very interesting people. So thanks very much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for hosting me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.